Pix 11's Nicole Johnson spoke to the officers who have formed a lasting bond in the wake of a devastating loss.
1575 Bronx River Avenue.
The images were shocking. A wild, deadly shooting involving police and a man who appeared to have nothing to lose, with 17 prior arrests. The scene expanded for miles. Our coverage extensive.
The first sergeant who died shot in the head.
They caught up with the gunman.
The suspect ran out of this building.
For weeks, this city mourned the death of NYPD Sergeant Paul Tuzzolo, a 19-year veteran killed instantly on November 4th when he responded to a domestic violence call.
Affirmative, confirmed shots fired and more injured.
Tuzzolo took the lead at the scene and the first bullets to shield his colleagues. He was shot close range in the head. His last words warning the other officers that the suspect, Manuel Rosales, had a gun. It saved their lives, including Sergeant Emmanuel Quo, also shot. He remembers bleeding from a bullet wound to his leg.
I definitely felt that I had been shot. However, at that moment, my worries, my concerns were about the well-being of everyone else that was on that scene, especially Paul.
It's been 3 months since the shooting, and for the first time, we're hearing exclusively a first-hand account of what happened and all of the emotions that are still raw.
It's hard to put into words all the range of emotions that went through my head and the other officers that were on the scene that day. Knowing that I still had use of my leg because I could feel it. I knew that I was hurt, but I knew I could keep going, so I had to keep going.
They are requesting the blood bank for the job in the 4-3.
It's a very tough thing for any police officer to imagine losing a friend, a coworker, especially as violent as we lost Paul.
And it was unbelievable at first to the men and women who work out of the 43rd Precinct in the Bronx, especially to the commanding officer, Inspector Fausto Pichardo. He remembers when he received the call, Tuzzolo didn't make it.
Take probably the most crucial seconds that you'll probably ever take after receiving that phone call, and you think about the families.
And those crucial seconds turned into minutes.
It's a feeling like no other. You know, so many people think that police officers, they throw on a uniform and they have this rugged appearance and they go out on the street and they fight crime, they take guns off the street, they deal with the drama and the people and everything that goes on in the street. And deep down, we're all human beings too.
Inspector Pichardo turned to a team of NYPD specialists, the men and women who make up the Employee Relations Section, or ERS. Chief Thomas Burns heads the unit. ERS has the tough job of making that initial call to notify families that their loved ones are not coming home.
Our job then is to confirm the worst. So we go in there, we try to do it as gentle or as less painful as possible, but there's no good way to deliver that type of news.
Sergeant Tuzzolo's funeral is where we saw a sea of blue, a blanket of support. His devastated wife and 2 young boys were surrounded by their NYPD family, Chief Burns and Inspector Pichardo, who handed Tuzzolo's wife the American flag.
What did you say to her?
It's one of those moments that you really, it's so intimate that it's just meant for her years. I will never forget that moment. Her courage, it helped a tremendous amount of officers in this precinct.
We will never know what was said in that private moment, but from that moment on, what has followed has been a long-lasting bond between everyone involved.
We try to get that family back to some type of new normal. And the relationship that you have is such a strong relationship that it lasts forever, indefinitely.
Getting back to a new normal has already happened for Sergeant Quo. He's back on the job, patrolling, moving forward in honor of his friend and colleague.
He saved my life, and for that I am forever grateful to him. On November 4th, I did feel like it could have been me. There's no rhyme or reason to why it was Paul and not me. But, you know, that's what happened. And, you know, I just have to live with that knowledge and do my best moving forward to honor his memory and honor his sacrifice.
Commanding Officer Pichardo carries a heavy load, leading all of the officers from the 43rd Precinct, including Sergeant Quo, back out onto the streets to protect and serve. We have only scratched the surface on the NYPD brotherhood and the kind of support it takes to heal. Coming up tomorrow night at 10, see another commanding officer deal with the same thing and hear more about that special unit we introduced you to.
All right, Nicole Johnson, thank you so much.
We continue our special series tonight about how the NYPD heals after tragedy. Every time an officer is killed in the line of duty, he leaves behind two families. Tonight, we get an exclusive first-hand account of the night Detective Randolph Holder was shot in East Harlem, and how his family in blue is dealing with that loss.
Unit, FDR Drive, 105 Central.
It was an instant headline maker. It's been more than a year, but to the officers involved, it feels like yesterday.
FDR by what? Let me get a unit to FDR 112. Shots fired.
A young NYPD officer, Detective Randolph Holder, murdered, shot dead while pursuing a violent suspect. As fellow officers rush to the scene, they hear this radio call.
That's when we heard the call when they transmitted, hey, shots fired, and then Wallace came over and said, you know, that his partner was down. Get me help, hurry up. I remember him saying, hurry up, my partner's shot. But as he's saying that, you can hear the shots that were being fired, you know?
They hear the suspect, Tyrone Howard, allegedly unloading his gun. But police officer Michael Vega and Inspector Raimundo Mundo continue to race to the scene. Parts of the FDR Drive and East 120th Street are shut down.
This was just eerie. It was just nothing I've ever heard before. I will never forget, because you hear the shots coming over. You hear the shots coming over the radio. Now you know it's for real, like we're in this.
We ran and ran and ran and ran. I remember us being very exhausted running on the FDR trying to find Holder and his partner.
At that point, these officers knew Holder had already been shot, and Howard, the accused gunman, was still on the loose.
It was tough. It was tough. At that point, I thought I was nervous before. I think I was nervous going there, nervous getting there. At that point, I can say I became scared. And I remember saying to him, hey, be careful, hug the trees, go on the sides, take your weapon out, because I'm sure we're gonna come face to face with this individual.
What gave them a bit of relief is Howard was eventually caught in custody nearby. That's also when reality set in. Inspector Mundo was the commanding officer of PSA 5. Holder was one of his officers. So with a heavy heart, Mundo had to maintain a level head and push on. There was a crime scene, an investigation, an officer down, and a suspect to deal with.
I knew that I needed to go to the hospital with Detective Holder and that I could rely on the other captains that were there also fairly quickly to manage that scene. Because I knew, I mean, it's my officer. I knew I had to go to the hospital. So I immediately went to the hospital. You know, I was going through a lot of emotions at the time. I was upset. I was disappointed. But this whole time, I'm just praying about his survival. And then eventually we found out that he just wasn't going to make it, and so everything at that point kind of shifted, you know.
Shifted from his years of tactical training to the toughest part of his job, something Inspector Mundo could never prepare for.
Now I'm dealing with this tragedy, and then the officers are arriving, and then we knew the family was arriving, so now it's time to face the family and, give them this tragic news.
Detective Holder's family was strong, especially his father, who wanted to speak with all of the officers there that night at Harlem Hospital.
That moment, I knew how strong of a man he was. And I've actually shared this with him because he wanted to let the officers know that it was going to be okay. That although his son was just killed, although this is a tragedy, and although this is not what was supposed to happen, that this is what comes sometimes, this is what happens in life sometimes.
Being a parent myself, I can't imagine what it is to lose a child. And to see him, the strength that he had, the courage that he portrayed to us, kind of made us feel better about ourselves.
It was a long night for the Holder family and the officers, and it was far from over.
And a lot of people don't know that when we took the drive down with Detective Holder, when they went to take him down to the morgue and his body, we took that long drive, just me and the inspector, just trying to contemplate, the day's actions. Like, what did it all go wrong? Like, what happened? Like, just thinking that it's all like, a bad dream. We stood there with his body, for a long time.
To get through it all, Deputy Inspector Mundo wore two hats, one as a counselor, the other someone who also needed moral support himself.
That's tough. I don't think there's any training that can prepare you for that, but you have to realize that you have to gather your thoughts and realize that everyone's depending on you now.
The community showed exactly how they felt wrapping themselves around the officers from that precinct, showing support in many ways, with flowers, candles, notes, you name it. Then there's the support you cannot see from within the police department.
We also have our employee relations unit that also was there right away to make sure that I was okay.
Of course, Deputy Inspector Mundo pulls strength from his family as well, and that trickles down to his officers. But what he is talking about right there is a special unit and what they do to help everyone. We get an inside look at the NYPD's Employee Relations Section, a unit that has no limits. When tragedy hits home, hear their personal stories, Monday at 10.
Pix 11's Nicole Johnson has more on what goes on behind the scenes when an officer makes the ultimate sacrifice.
We've just shattered a family's life. I apologize.
NYPD Sergeant Patrick Whalen is a part of a brotherhood, a band of blue. But when that blue turns red, nothing can prepare even the toughest battle-tested officers for heartbreak. Sergeant Whalen was a part of the team that notified the families of Detective Wenjin Liu and Detective Rafael Ramos after they were ambushed, shot dead in their patrol car back in 2014.
When we meet the family, we try to put them at ease. It's not always easy. One of the things that I do is I introduce myself as Sergeant Whalen and then immediately say, please call me Pat, and that's how I hope I'm remembered with our families. Not as a sergeant, not as somebody from the police department, but as Pat, who's here to help the family.
And it's that human approach, that selfless spirit that makes up the 23-member Employee Relations Section, or ERS, an elite unit with a very tough job. They step in after the darkest moments. Chief Burns, a 32-year-old veteran, heads ERS. He tells us what it takes.
It takes a special person to be able to provide a shoulder to cry on, to think clearly in crisis situation when everybody else is falling apart. And I've been extremely lucky to have a team that are able to do this job and do it very well.
The work of ERS does not stop after notification. They are with families and fellow officers as long as they need. That is Chief Burns. We see him over and over at countless funerals of officers, right next to the families. We never really take notice, but Burns is a staple to the families, a beacon of light. His strength helps everyone get to a new normal, whatever that may be.
Unfortunately, the police department has a lot of experience with this kind of work, and we learn from each other. So it's something that's handed down from guys that, when I first came in the unit, they taught me, and then we passed that information or that know-how down to the new guys. But it's I can't stress how difficult it is.
This isn't just a 15-minute situation. This is ongoing, and each officer has a different way of coping and managing the loss that they're feeling too. Bearing in mind that these men and women in the department also have to go out and patrol, so we want to make sure that their health is important and that they realize that they're not here alone.
The leaders within the department are never alone as well, including commanding officers of precincts dealing with death.
It's a feeling like no other.
We first introduce you to Inspector Fausto Pichardo, CO of the 43rd Precinct in the Bronx, and Deputy Inspector Raimundo Mundo, former CO of PSA 5, now of the 34th Precinct. Both men have recently lost officers to gun violence, but the support and passion from those men turned into purpose for all of the officers who were grieving in different ways, and communication was key.
When you walk into a precinct and blue lights are hanging outside of the precinct and flowers and teddy bears, and the hallways are lined with hundreds of police officers on and off duty, you speak from the heart.
Employee Relations also works with NYPD chaplains and the ceremonial unit to help the families. And keep in mind, all of the men and women you see on the streets in this city on the job wearing the blue uniform, well, they all have families who pray every day they return home safe. That's also something we cannot see.